Okay, so thank you so much to everybody for joining us today for the Creating Connecticut program presented by Walt Woodward, the Connecticut State Historian. First, I just wanted to mention some upcoming library events. Switch this slide here. So I wanted to let everybody know that summer reading has begun. There are chances to win prizes all summer long. If you want to register for summer reading, you can go on the library website, or you can give us a call here at Bloomfield Public Library, and a staff member would be happy to assist you. We have a free vaccination clinic coming up at McMahon Wintonbury. There is no appointment required. It will be the Moderna vaccine. That's from 5 to 8 p.m. on June 24th, July 22nd, and August 19th. So spread the word, please. All are welcome. And then we also have a gentle yoga virtual program coming up on Thursdays at 6:30 p.m. Between June 24th and August 12th. And we also have library building committee meetings that are open to the public. The next one is on June 30th. It's every other Wednesday at 6 p.m. And we really encourage library supporters, patrons, residents to attend those meetings and stay informed about what's going on with the library building project. And for more information about all of this, you can go to bplct.org. That's the library's website, or give us a call here at the library and we can help you get some more information. So next, I wanted to introduce Ruthanne Marchetti from the Wintonbury Historical Society, our partner for today's program. Ruthanne was going to say a few words, so let me ask you to unmute and change the slide, and then you're all set, Ruthanne.
Thank you so much. First thing I want to say is thank you to Allison Wilkos and the library for hosting us, because we're not in that zone. They are just wonderful helpers. And those of you who don't know the library, you should get to know them, because though the building needs to be redone, the staff is top notch. And when you need help, they're there, including laminating your vaccination cards. So they're there for us. So I want to say, Allison, thank you for your special help with this. Before I introduce Walt, who is our wonderful speaker, I do want to say a little bit about the Wintonbury Historical Society. We are a group of volunteers, and we do celebrate everything Bloomfield, and not just old history, but we try to pay attention to current history as well. Several years ago, we had a house tour that was very successful, and this September, we are planning another tour, but because of COVID, we didn't want to ask people to go into people's houses. Instead, we are planning what we call an Artful garden tour. And Allison has, here it is, our slide. Thank you. It will be on September 19th, a Sunday. The hours will be between noon and 4 p.m. You can see the tickets in advance will be $20 and $25 at the door. We'll have information about it on our website. Just search Wintonbury Historical Society. This is a tour, once again, with Ironwood Community Partners. And both of us have special projects. It's a real bricks and mortar kind of a hopeful tour. Those of you who live in Bloomfield know that we are blessed with some wonderful historic buildings and properties. We have the old schoolhouse, 1796 brick schoolhouse, which is a very special building. And that very special building needs $80,000 worth of work. And yes, I saw Walt wince. And we have, because of what we've done so far, we've done a lot of human labor. Our own president has scraped and painted the windows, done a lot of things, but we really do need to do structural things. So we're hoping to raise money on the tour that will go toward the schoolhouse. Likewise, Ironwood Community Partners has been working very hard on the Philly House barns. And those of you who were in our group many years ago know that we have the Historical Society to thank for the fact that the 1832 Philly House was mothballed and saved from demolition, and the town now owns the property. So we are very fortunate to have these buildings, this property, but it takes money to keep them going. And though we are applying for grants, we need to roll up our own sleeves and work and help. So I hope that you will come to our tour. I hope if you want to help work on the tour, you'll contact me, and we will have that up on the website very soon. I also want to remind you that that wonderful schoolhouse, even though it needs work, is still special. And if you want to tour it, it's open most Sundays this summer. And information about that is also on the website. It's free, open to the public. And if you haven't been in it, you really owe it to yourself. And particularly if you have some kids or grandkids or nieces or nephews, bring them and let them ring that bell. The looks on those kids when they pull that cord and ring the bell it's magical. And they really do get a feel of the schoolhouse. So I invite you to join us. So that's my plug for the Historical Society. We welcome new members. We'll have more programs. But when we talk about programs, we have one person who we've invited back again and again because we just think that he's got so much to offer. His name is Walter Woodward, and he'll be with us today. I just want to say that this is the first time we've had him without his band. And those of you who've been at our year-end celebrations, Walt brings his band of
Band of Steady Habits.
The Band of Steady Habits, right? Yes. And they're so wonderful. They come, they're terrific. We're hoping to have them come again in the fall once we're allowed to gather. But for now, Walt Woodward is our Connecticut state historian. And I just can't say enough about how happy we are to have you back, Walt. He's a fountain of knowledge and he's a great presenter. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Ruth. And can Allison, everyone, can you hear me? Or am I still?
I can hear you. I think you're
We
good
can
to
hear
go.
you.
Excellent. All of the members of the band, I sort of feel like Scarlett O'Hara, that, you know, every time I have come to present to you, I have depended on the kindness of strangers, sort of strangers. I feel like I've been carried by the band. So I'm a little diffident today about how I'm going to do being solo, but I'm going to do my best. I'm so glad we get together. For me, coming to talk to you is kind of the transition into summer, or it has been for many years, and it's great. I saw as people were logging on, I saw Bill Weissenberger, who I was on the board of the Connecticut Historical Society with, and Barbara Beeching, who is just one of my most favored historians, and whose book on the black middle class in Hartford in the 19th century has kind of prompted this movement that has reawakened such interest in the Talcott Street Congregational Church as a center for abolitionism and for the human rights fight. So Barbara, Bill, it's wonderful to see you, and it's wonderful to see everybody. Tonight, because I don't have the band with me, I'm going to talk about my newest book, my latest book. It came out last year. It's still relatively new, and it's still so important to me. This is my fourth or fifth book, but it's actually my fifth book. Of all the books I've written, this is the one I lavished the most time on and tried so hard to make it a certain kind of book. And when I got done, and this has happened every time I have finished a book, and I think all authors do this, is when they get done, they think about how are you going to go out and introduce this book to the public? How are you going to tell them, what this book is for or about or whatever? So as I was thinking about this, because I every step of the way, I wanted this book to be kind of received the way it is intended. And in thinking about how to do this, I thought back to my very first graduate seminar at the University of Connecticut many, many years ago. And I'm coming in and I'm so excited. I am going to become now a professional historian. And wow, I'm there with my other brand new graduate students, and now we're drinking history out of a fire hose, a book in every class every week. We're all excited to share all these things we've read and what we know. And I went into a seminar with a man who is now my colleague and one of my most admired people. He is a distinguished university professor. That's a very rare designation at the University of Connecticut. His name is Richard D. Brown, Dick Brown. And so I go into this class and I am all excited to show what I've learned reading this book. And he sits down and he says, "Why did the author write this book?" I think I had prepared for every other question except that one. And over the next 3 hours, me and my new colleagues started unpacking that question, why we thought the author had written that book. And we did the same thing every week for the next 15 weeks. And excuse me, I'm going to try to stop this. I think I'm going, am I going in and out of focus, Allison?
Maybe just a tiny bit, but it wasn't distracting.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Over the next 15 weeks, we did the same thing. And I came to realize that that question, why did the author write this book, is really essential. What is it that makes an author think it's worth several years of his or her time to get something down on paper? And then why are they so bold to think that it's worth a week or several days or more of your time to actually read what they've written? So to introduce this book to you, I thought what I would do is share my screen now and pull up this little PowerPoint that I have created and go back to Dick Brown's first seminar and tell you why I wrote this book. As Connecticut State historian, I've had the good fortune to spend my career focusing my historical research on this state, its people, and their stories. Creating Connecticut is a product of that effort. It's a collection of 24 stories, 12 shorter, 12 longer, each of which tells us something important about Connecticut's past, something that still, in one way or another, affects our lives as Connecticutans today. All of them are designed to be readable, engaging, and informative introductions to aspects of our state's history that will be new or nearly so to most readers. Some of the stories in Creating Connecticut show people we thought we knew, Mark Twain, Nathan Hale, in new and surprising ways. Some tell us about people many of us don't know, Eleazar Wheelock, Samson Occam, Adrian Block, but perhaps we ought to. And many of the stories are about events, movements, and periods of change. The Pequot War, the Hartford Witch Hunt, outmigration to Connecticut's Western Reserve, Irish immigration into the state, crucial moments when Connecticutans were tested and called on by circumstances to change their minds, values, approaches, and even lives, times very much like the year we have just lived through. And some of the stories in this book are about the uniqueness of our state and the ways in which Connecticutans have celebrated their past in the past. The focus here is on stories that both interest and matter. You can read them from front to back. They're arranged more or less in chronological order, or you can scan the table of contents and jump in with the story that seems most interesting to you. My hope, and the reason I wrote this book, is that you will read them all and come away with a desire to know more about Connecticut history. So now you know why I wrote this book, and what I'd like to do with the rest of my talk is read passages from a few of the stories in Creating Connecticut. And I'm thinking some of these stories are taken from talks I've given. And I think you actually may have helped shape a couple of the stories you're about to hear with your comments in other lectures. Anyway, I'd like to read some passages from a few of the stories in Creating Connecticut, answer any questions you may have about them, and then close and tell you how you can get a copy to read. There are several ways, and from free to cheap to vastly expensive because they come with a signature from yours truly. Only kidding. And I'll begin with a reading from Creating Connecticut's first story about Connecticut's restless beginnings and the 50 years of conflict between the Dutch and English and the indigenous people of this state, a restless era that is today an all but forgotten part of our history. It begins on a day in April in the year 1614. In the spring of 1614, Adrian Block sailed the little ship he had built and named Onrust, restlessness, into the river the Algonquians called Connecticut, or the place of the long water. The 47-year-old Dutchman was as restless as his vessel and anxious to make up the losses he had experienced the previous winter when his ship Tiger had accidentally burned to the waterline at Manhattan. The trader and explorer was anxious, too, to secure the Dutch government's recent promise of a trading monopoly over any new countries or harbors discovered by Dutch explorers. Restless to turn his fortunes around, Block came up a river that was itself restless, running fresh and full of upriver snowmelt and spring rain. He named the river the Versha, meaning fresh, as in fast running, and as the first known European to probe its courses and seek its opportunities, he launched an era of restlessness that would change this river and its people forever. Then, as now, restless had many meanings, and all would apply to the world the arrival of this little boat would create. A generation of restless Europeans, both Dutch and English, constantly in motion, never ceasing or pausing, would come to the Connecticut, the place of the long water, first in search of trade with the indigenous people, and soon after in quest of those people's lands and resources. Some of them were spiritually restless, troubled in mind and soul, and seeking a place to serve their God as their consciences demanded. For the Native Americans already here, the arrival of the Onrust heralded a new restlessness, first as they jostled to control distribution of European trade goods, and later as they fought the incoming insurgents' efforts to take their land and control their lives. For Connecticut's first peoples, the arrival of the Onrust brought centuries of restlessness, literal unrest, sleepless worry, sickness, turmoil, and death. Time is the acid rain of historical memory. Slowly, often over generations stretching into centuries, important details of the past can fade one by one until what was once crucial to the life of a time and people is all but forgotten. So it has been with the Dutch history of Connecticut. Most school children are still taught that the first European to come to Connecticut was Adrian Block, and many students of Hartford history know the Dutch had a trading house there, somewhere close to the later site of Samuel Colt's manufacturing complex. But for the average Connecticut, that's the sum of it. The English arrived, and the Dutch faded to black. The rest of the colonial story as they remember it is a simplistic tale of English versus Indians that quickly morphs into one about patriots versus Tories. But that's not how it was. For its first 50 years, Connecticut was a restless, seething site of constant competition, pitting nation against nation, tribe against tribe, and colonies against colonies in a Rubik's Cube of combinations that always involved the Dutch. Nothing was done by the English at Connecticut without first calculating the Dutch response in New Netherland or at the States General, the seat of government in The Hague. No English settlement was expanded, no tribal alliance contracted, no trading venture launched without calculating the Dutch reaction. The Dutch Connecticut story was a deeply conflicted, harrowing, and sometimes horrifying experience. Those who lived in that time knew their lives depended on knowing it in great detail. Now, I go on in that chapter to highlight the nearly continuous state of conflict between the various English plantations, the Dutch authorities, and Indian communities, and the shifting alliances that made life a restless and fearful struggle for everyone in the Connecticut's first half century. It was a restless era that set the stage for so much that came after, including Connecticut's unique history of witch hunting. In another chapter, I look at some of the issues that history poses. Connecticut's record in handling witchcraft cases raises many questions. Some are unique to Connecticut, some apply to all witch hunts. Why, for example, in the early years of witch hunting, 1647 to 1663, was Connecticut New England's fiercest prosecutor of witches? Why did it switch from being the region's greatest witch killer to the colony that ended executions permanently a generation before Salem? Why did people even believe in witchcraft? What exactly did people think witches could do, and why did it scare them? Why were most witches women? And what is it that made someone who had been a neighbor for many years suddenly so dangerous that community safety made executing them mandatory? Well, the answer to those questions began not here in Connecticut, but in Europe. And in the chapter, I trace the Renaissance history of witch hunting and explain the magical view of the world that made such hunts possible. Then I discuss the English witch hunts that were peaking when the Puritans first emigrated to Connecticut. The Puritans who came to New England in the early decades of the 1600s carried their fear of the devil and his minions to New England along with their Bibles, clothing, and seed stock. England's greatest witch hunt took place between 1644 and 1647 in the Puritan counties of East Anglia. There, a man named Matthew Hopkins, who styled himself England's witch finder general, led a witch hunt that resulted in many executions, some say as many as 300. Now, the East Anglian location of Hopkins' witch hunt is significant. It's the place from which many of Connecticut's early settlers emigrated. They knew much about, and some had direct connections to, the Hopkins trials. Many must have feared that if the devil was assaulting the English Puritans that furiously in East Anglia, it was only a matter of time until he would find his way to New England. So it's not surprising, therefore, that New England's first execution for witchcraft took place in 1647, just as the witch hunt in England was winding down. Now, perhaps the most interesting thing about this first New England witch death is that we wouldn't know anything about it, except for two sentences that appeared in two different documents produced 100 miles away from each other and found some 250 years apart. Sometime between March and May of 1647, Massachusetts Governor John Winthrop, whose History Journal of New England is one of our most important historical sources from this period, wrote in that journal the following sentence: one, and he left a blank, of Windsor, arraigned and executed at Hartford for a witch. Now, Winthrop left the blank space intending, no doubt, to add the witch's name once he had received further information. But for the next 257 years, that's all that was known. Some person who lived in Windsor was tried for witchcraft in Hartford and then executed. What was she charged with? Who conducted the trial? Who testified against her? What was her defense? Where was she hanged? None of this was known. In truth, historians didn't even know whether New England's first convicted witch was a man or a woman. Then, in 1904, Annie Elliott Trumbull, daughter of Connecticut's first state librarian, announced that she had come into possession of a little old volume with a worn sheepskin binding that contained the manuscript diary of Matthew Grant, a resident of Windsor from 1635 to 1681. In it, she reported, she had found a Grant-penned entry stating that on May 26, 1647, Alice Young was hanged. Finally, after 2.5 centuries, it was confirmed that New England's first executed witch was, as supposed, a woman, and that her name was Alice Young. Now that remains most of what is known for certain about her, though historian Richard Ross has recently argued that Alice emigrated to Windsor from London in 1640, and that may have put her culturally at odds with her Windsor neighbors, most of whom had emigrated from the English West Country. Now, those cultural differences, Ross argues, made her an outsider, which, combined with an epidemic of deadly influenza that hit Windsor the year of Young's execution, may have factored in her being singled out for prosecution. This chapter goes on to detail Connecticut's record as early New England's fiercest prosecutor of witchcraft, and how one man, Governor John Winthrop Jr., himself an alchemist and magic practitioner, intervened to bring witch executions in Connecticut to an end. It's a powerful story, I think, with a message just as important as any of those from the better-known Salem trials, and it's one I think you would enjoy. Now, for the past decade, many Connecticutans, and especially our younger generation, have left our state to seek their fortunes elsewhere. This is truly troublesome, but it's not the first time it's happened. In another chapter, I tell the story of the great outflux of young Connecticutans in the early 1800s, as the dream or necessity of finding a better life took them to a part of Ohio known as the Connecticut Western Reserve. Here are a few passages that talk about their journeys west and their feelings about leaving. Connecticut in the early 19th century, as in the 21st century, was hemorrhaging its young people, the lifeblood of its community, to other, more economically attractive locations, and it had been doing so for a long time. Although they dispersed to sites both far and near, one area in particular proved the most powerful magnet for Connecticut expatriates. This was a part of northeast Ohio stretching 120 miles west from the Pennsylvania border, a place many people called New Connecticut, but which was also known and is today still called Connecticut's Western Reserve. This was a part of its original charter territory that Connecticut reserved ownership of when it ceded the remainder of its charter lands to the newly formed United States in 1786. The journey west was both long and hard, between 500 and 650 miles, depending on the route selected and the destination. Road conditions ranged from very bad to deplorable for most of the journey. In heavy rains, roads became mud pits and streams impassable. In some low-lying or wetland areas, efforts were made to ameliorate the muddy conditions by building corduroy roads of logs placed perpendicular to the direction of travel, which provided their own unique kind of jarring discomfort. It was an experience no traveler would ever forget. In addition to the considerable physical dangers of traveling bad roads, fording swelled rivers and streams, and climbing and descending high mountain passes, migrants commonly experienced inhospitable treatment at overcrowded and often squalid inns and taverns. They slept fitfully among strangers, ate bad food with rowdy, drunken, and sometimes dangerous fellow migrants, and fought off both homesickness and fear of the unknown. How did all these migrants feel about pulling up roots and leaving their native state? Some undoubtedly felt a pioneer's excitement at facing a world that was all possibility. Others, perhaps younger sons not in line to inherit the family farm, seethed with resentment about being forced into exile. And some, it is clear, saw having to leave Connecticut for the West as a sign of shame, a visible symbol that they were the expendable ones. How else can we explain Margaret Van Horn Dwight's comment on day 2 of her journey? The country we pass through till we are beyond New York, I need not describe to you, nor indeed could I, for I am attended by a very unpleasant, though not uncommon companion, one to whom I have bowed in subjection ever since I left you, pride. It has entirely prevented me seeing the country, lest I should be known, and so I suppose it will attend me to the mountains, and then I am sure it will bid me adieu. Hiding in the wagons so she wouldn't be recognized. This is an aspect of outmigration that we rarely encounter or even think about. But once we confront that, it complicates all those long-standing views of Anglos hot in the pursuit of manifest destiny. Surely, Connecticutans left their state with very mixed emotions. But even as young Connecticutans were moving out of the state, others were moving in. Connecticut had found its future in harnessing its abundant water power to drive the factories of the Industrial Revolution, and that created an unprecedented need for workers to build a new kind of infrastructure. The Irish in Connecticut chapter covers nearly 350 years of the Irish story here, but today I'd like to present just 3 quick snapshots. The first of what it was like for the Irish who arrived in Connecticut in the years just before the potato famine of the mid-1840s, and then flash forward a half century to look at what life was like for the children and grandchildren of those migrants 50 years later, and finally just take a quick view at what it means to be an Irish Connecticut today. So, on we go. Enter the Irish. To meet the need for laborers, contractors for the Farmington Canal brought in 28 gangs of Irish canal workers called navvies from Galway and Cork. Hartford brought in 400 Irishmen for the Enfield Canal project. Life for the navvies was hellish. Like the Irish railroad track workers who soon followed them, they dug furiously sun up to sunset, goaded by overseer contractors whose profits depended on how much labor they could extract every day. Eyewitnesses marveled at the physical prowess of the Irishmen as they ran full wheelbarrows up narrow planks from ditches 20 feet deep. They lived in temporary shanty camps where overcrowding, poor sanitation, and stagnant water made disease a constant. Alcohol was woven into a workday marked by short bursts of furious digging, followed by a trip to the whiskey barrel and a dram from the jigger boss. Irish workers were paid only for the days weather and their health let them work. And they earned just 75 cents a day, 1/3 less than native workers. The navvies represented Connecticut's first major influx of practicing Irish Catholics, and the descendants of Connecticut's Puritan founders didn't like that one bit. Pardon me for 1 second. I'm going to grab a glass of water right here. There you go. Thank you for your patience. 1 sip and I'll keep going. Oh, that's helpful. The navvies represented Connecticut's first major influx of practicing Irish Catholics, and the descendants of Connecticut's Puritan founders didn't like that one bit. Connecticut had no resident priests, and the Yankees made it clear that that was just fine with them. When Reverend John Powers of New York requested permission to celebrate Mass for canal workers at New Haven's Protestant Seamen's Chapel on Long Wharf, he was told, "We have no popery in New Haven, and we don't want any." Despite this overt intolerance, popery did come to Connecticut, at first through the services of an itinerant priest from Rhode Island, who in 1828 conducted house masses on the east bank of the river in Hartford. The following year, Hartford became home to Most Holy Trinity Church, Connecticut's first Catholic church. The newspaper, the Connecticut Observer, was simply aghast. How will it read in history that in 1829, Hartford, in the state of Connecticut, was made the center of a Roman Catholic mission? Well, let's jump forward 50 years and see how the children and the grandchildren of those unwanted first-comers are doing. Unlike their fathers, by 1900, 2/3 of second-generation Irish men worked in skilled trades or higher, with economic security mirroring that of the Connecticut Yankees. Irish-American men dominated police and fire departments and monopolized the building trades. And, while 90% of their mothers remained domestic servants, second-generation Irish-American daughters rose to become clerks, skilled factory workers, teachers, and union organizers too. Better jobs came in part because of high Irish involvement in Connecticut's labor movement. Irish Americans made up most of many unions' membership and their leadership. Well, let's jump forward another 50 years, well, actually another century, more than a century, and look at what it's like to be Irish in Connecticut today. To be an Irish Connecticut in the 21st century is, for those lucky enough to claim Irish American ancestry, a source of both identity and pride, underscored by an extraordinary long-term record of Irish Connecticut's achievements in politics, law, public safety, commerce, industry, and culture. The fact that such achievements were made by a people once reviled as incapable, discriminated against as inferior, and treated as unwelcome interlopers in a society that took offense at their very presence is an important reminder, especially in times like these, that the very people we fear at one moment can sometimes turn out to be the source of some of our society's greatest strengths. Connecticut's most important cultural icon, and we're home to many, is the Gilded Age author and satirist Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain. His historic home in Hartford is also one of the country's great historic landmarks. In Mark Twain and the Historic House Problem, I come right out and ask the question I think everyone asks when they visit the house of this great man. I think a lot of people think it, but they're a little too shy to ask. Not me. I just walk up to the docent, to the person leading the tour, and I say, "Excuse me, I'd like to know something. Why can't I smell smoke?" Twain was no ordinary smoker. He was a deeply committed, unregenerate, professional pipe and cigar smoker who mastered his craft at an early age and continued to improve upon it for the next 68 years. In the great age of industrial production, Twain turned himself into a literary factory, belching cigar smoke as the words poured forth. Wherever Twain went, tobacco smoke followed, and one of his greatest fears was to be where tobacco wasn't. In 1867, one day before sailing to Honolulu from British Columbia, Twain found a local wholesale tobacconist and bought 3,000 cheroots, those are small cigars, and 15 pounds of tobacco. That was about one cigar per nautical mile of the impending voyage. Later that afternoon, he went back and bought 3,000 more cheroots. And that night, shortly after beginning a farewell public lecture, Twain stopped his talk in midstream, called his manager up to the stage and said, "Pond, I fear that cigar place may close before I get through here. Go there now and get 1,500 more of those cheroots." In the morning, Twain and his 7,500 cigars, plus his tobacco, happily embarked for the Sandwich Isles. Now, Twain knew smoking was generally unhealthy, but he saw the habit as a kind of life vest that provided a wellness safety margin. He liked to tell the story of the doctor who visited an 80-year-old woman who was in rapidly failing health. "You must stop drinking," he told her. "I never touched a drop of alcohol in my life," she answered. "Then you must immediately give up smoking," the doctor ordered. "I have never, ever smoked," she said indignantly. "Well then," the doctor replied, "there's no way I can help you. You are a sinking ship with no freight to throw overboard." Well, I suspect most people would agree that elections in recent years, at least some of them, have left people on both sides of the aisle with a pretty bitter taste in their mouths. That's why it might be time to revive one of the state's oldest and for centuries most time-honored traditions, the Connecticut election cake. Now, what's an election cake, and why is it a Connecticut tradition? An election cake was a big, rich fruit, spice, and sugar yeast cake baked up in huge quantities and served to all comers during the festivities surrounding first our colonies and later our state's elections. The story of how election cake became a Connecticut tradition goes all the way back to the early days of the Puritans. One of the things that made the Puritans so pure was that they didn't believe in the annual round of Catholic and Anglican holidays. They didn't celebrate Christmas or Easter or any of the numerous saints and festival days, and for them, New Year's Day came on March 25th, so no midnight kisses or dropping ball either. Now, while they rejected all of these supposedly invented occasions for mirth, they did believe that in the year 1662, Connecticut, for reasons still not exactly clear, got something that very much was worth celebrating, a royal charter from King Charles II that gave the Connecticut colony virtual independence more than a century before the American Revolution. Unlike Massachusetts and Virginia and the other royally governed American colonies, Connecticut could make its own laws and, more important, elect its own leaders without royal oversight. This right to choose their own leaders was seen from the start as fundamentally important and distinctive, worth celebrating and worth protecting. So it's not surprising that on those days when Connecticutans gathered to choose their leaders, back then Election Day took place in early May, these otherwise celebration-starved Puritans found reason to celebrate, and what better way to do so than with cake, and lots of it. We know Connecticutans were feasting on Election Day cakes well before the American Revolution because the colonial records tell us so. And if incorporating election cake into the ceremonies was an important Connecticut tradition before the American Revolution, it became even more important afterwards. As Connecticutans themselves spread across the country to the new lands in the American West, the election cake tradition went with them. Election cake recipes appear in early cookbooks in states across the nation, and they are abundantly found in the manuscript cookbooks left by individuals in our historical societies and archives. Reading these works, a few things become crystal clear. Election cakes were central to the election rituals in many places, but especially here in Connecticut. Making an extraordinary election cake, perhaps with one's own special ingredient or mixing process. Believe me, these old recipes are like, they're very much like chemistry. A lot of work went into making an election cake. Then making a very good one became a point of honor with many home keepers. Having a reputation for making a delicious election cake became a competitive source of status. During the 1800s, as Connecticut industrialized, welcomed people from many new nations, broke its official ties to the old Puritan church, and experienced the sectional divide that led to the American Civil War, some of Connecticut's time-honored Election Day traditions, riding out to meet the new governor as he made his way into the Capitol, and parading behind the state's ministers to hear an election sermon in the First Congregational Church. These fell by the wayside, but the election cake remained a steady and delicious habit. When the General Assembly decided in 1876 to change the start of its sessions from May to early January, beginning in 1877, a journalist lamenting the switch of Election Day to midwinter said, "The coming election parade of May 1876 is likely to be the last that will take place in Connecticut. Though the sermon has gone out, though the parade is going out, though the whole institution may become an element of the past, one feature of it will always remain, and that is the election cake. Lovers of it, when it's just right, say no other cake equals it. It's only necessary to add that nobody can make it but a Connecticut housekeeper, and that each housekeeper in her circle of adherents knows that she can make it a deal better than any of her rivals." Well, I've been thinking for a while that perhaps this is exactly the right time for the Connecticut election cake to make its comeback. At this moment, when American politics seems so divisive and so bitter, wouldn't it be great if a cohort of culinary Connecticutans, men and women equally this time, joined together to use their ovens to remind people that democracy, this right to choose the people who rule our government, is a sweet privilege indeed. And what better way could there be to celebrate sweet democracy than to bring back the tradition of the Connecticut election cake? Now, in the book, I have printed a modern, I don't know if I have it on, I guess not. In the book, I've printed a modernized, easy-to-cook election cake recipe. So if you want to find it, you can buy the book. But I would really like to see this tradition take off. And the last thing I would want to do is make anyone buy my book to get a recipe. So here's the deal. In a few seconds, I am going to put up my email address at UConn. It is the easiest email address of all the thousands of people at the university. Who can't remember ever where I put my car keys, can remember this on first hearing. It's walt@uconn.edu. And if you would like an election cake recipe, just send me an email, say, send me the recipe, and I will get one off to you. All I would ask is that you give it a try, and if you give it a try, share that cake with someone you know whose politics are completely different from yours. You don't have to talk about politics, but what I would like you to do is sit down and share cake and talk about the blessing of democracy and how wonderful it is to live in a country where you actually get to choose the people who run the show. So that's my wish, and I hope you do ask for it. Now, oh my goodness, I've gotten ahead of myself. Hang on. There we go. So that's an overview of Creating Connecticut, but it's just an overview of the 24 stories that are in it. In addition, among the stories that I didn't read, there's one about the rough justice meted out by the British to Connecticut's state hero, Nathan Hale. There's another story that recounts 1935's Pull Out All the Stops 300th anniversary of Connecticut's founding. If there ever was a Lollapalooza in this state, it was that one. There's the story of the inspiring 275-year-old story of the Lyman's family, whatever it takes devotion to make and keep Lyman orchards a thriving Connecticut farm. There's a story about the Puritans' only art form, and that's gravestone carving, oddly enough, and one of the great gravestone carvers. And there's a profile of Irish-born Governor John Dempsey, who, in addition to being one of the most popular governors of Connecticut ever, was the only immigrant governor of Connecticut since the colonial era. And there's a meditation on what it is about Connecticut that makes Connecticut such a unique state. And that's just a sample. I hope that you'll like what you've heard enough to want to read Creating Connecticut. And if you do, you'll stop by Allison's desk and check out a copy at the library. You can also order a copy on Amazon. I can tell you right now, they actually get them almost cheaper than I can get them from the publisher. So it's amazing. You can, if you have Prime, I think the last time I checked, which was a couple days ago, it was $20.49, cheaper if you get the Kindle version. If you would like a signed copy, I would be happy to send you a signed copy with any inscription you want that wouldn't lead to an indictment for $30. But I have to tell you, I want people to read this book, and the easiest way to get it, the best way to get it, whatever works for you. I've spent much of my I suspect this will be my last career, but I've spent many years now promoting the history of this amazing state to the people of this state, and I think it's so important that people reconnect or stay connected with all of the wonderful stories that make the place we live in so much richer and our lives so much better, and that still have so much influence on what happens to us in our day-to-day lives, that my mission is whatever way you can do it. I hope I've piqued your interest enough to want to pick up this book from somewhere and read it. I thank you so much for your time. I thank you for having me back. I feel like now I can say, June 21st wasn't the official day of summer, the first day of summer. The day I talked to Wintonbury is the first day of summer. So now I can go out and see if the corn's ready. So thank you so much. I'll be happy to answer any questions. And I do really, to see you here on a day that is so beautiful and not hot at the end of June, I consider it just a great honor. Thank you so much. So Allison or Ruthanne, you can now have the screen back.
All right. Thank you. Oh, Ruthanne. There you go.
I have a question. And first of all, before a question, I have to say that, Walt, even without your band, I thought you were pretty wonderful.
Oh, thank
So
you.
I just want to thank you very, very much. And I can't wait to read the book.
That's exciting.
Well, I am looking forward to reading it. My one question is, I know about the Western Reserve of Ohio. What about the Firelands? I thought that had something to do with Connecticut too. Could you say a little something about that, please?
Absolutely. Connecticut actually retained two parts of Ohio. The deal that the new federal government made with the states, and this was perhaps Alexander Hamilton's most brilliant idea. He wanted all of the new states to be tied to the federal government in a very important way. So he made a deal with them. He said, the federal government will take on all of the revolutionary debt you incurred during the Revolutionary War. We'll pay it off if you'll give us all of those lands that you have in your original charters that you haven't used yet. We will use that to sell to people to pay the war debt. And it'll all be done by the federal government. And Hamilton's idea is that the wealthy people of the country would then invest in those Western lands as land speculators. And so the wealthiest and most important people in the country would be deeply tied. Their actual fortunes would be tied to the federal government. So Connecticut agreed, even though it had paid off most of its war debt. We were very frugal Yankees back then. and they gave up their lands, but they said, we want to keep two chunks. We're going to keep one chunk that we're going to use to sell to help support our schools, and we're going to keep another chunk to pay for reparations for the people who, along the Connecticut shoreline, whose homes were burned and destroyed by the British when they invaded in 1779 and 1781. So those lands were called the fire lands because they were given in grants to people whose homes had been destroyed by fire during the two different sets of British attacks in the late 1779, one by Benedict Arnold. Much of that land, though, it took so long for that land to open up that a lot of the people who were given those lands not only never got to see the firelands, but they sold them at deeply discounted prices early on. So they only got a fraction of the value. They never recovered the value that they had lost in the war, but land speculators did do a pretty good job later on, but they had to hold on to them for a long time to get it pay off. So neat question. And and what's really funny, not funny, but if you drive west, you ever are going west or heading for Chicago and you drive over there, if you stop in any of the towns from the Pennsylvania border to Cleveland and just go drive around, you'll think you are in Connecticut. It's those towns are so much like the state of Connecticut. And as you move west, you begin to see a different influence in the architecture, but they still have Connecticut names. There's Norwalk, there's, all these Connecticut towns that were settled as you move over to Toledo. So, sorry, enough of that.
Thanks.
Good question, Ruthanne. You get an A. You get an A for participation in this class.
I was going to say too, if there are other questions, you can put them in the chat box, or you could flag me down and wave and I'll unmute you. All right, I'm not seeing much, so I think we could probably wrap up.
Well, that is just, it is beautiful. In case you haven't noticed, there's a beautiful day out there, and what you are doing here is beyond me, when you could either be outside working in the garden or declaring it cocktail hour. So thank all of you so much for your time. It's really wonderful. I do hope you will write me at walt@uconn.edu and request an election cake recipe. I'd love to see a picture of your cake as we move into the next round of elections. And they're going to be so soon. I'm going to be, I'm going to be a cake evangelist. So,
Well, I was going to say, we did get a question in the chat.
Yes. Okay.
It says, do you go into the slave trade in Connecticut?
I talk about Connecticut's history of abolition, which is not very, the chapter is titled Connecticut's Slow Walk to Abolition, and that pretty much describes what happened. And there are several places, as you will find throughout this book, the question of race in Connecticut continually comes up in the history of slavery. But there are several people who had done recent books on slavery or on the history of African Americans in Connecticut, including Barbara Beeching, Elizabeth Norman in Connecticut Explored. So my focus was to bring stories. Don Williams, former state senator, did a wonderful book on Prudence Crandall. I decided I would work on stories largely that didn't cover that topic because those were in print. I wanted to do stories that hadn't been in print for a while. But you cannot write Connecticut history without directly confronting questions of race. So they are there, and I am hoping to do a second version of this, and they will figure even more prominently. So thank you for that question.
And then Elizabeth asks, is Matthew Hopkins an ancestor of Johns Hopkins?
Wow, what a really good question. I have no idea, but I'm just so intrigued. I am so intrigued at the possibility, just the fun you could have with that. So I don't know, but maybe I'll go to Ancestry.com tonight and see what I can find out.
Okay, thank you, Walt. I think we are all set. But just again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you all, and everybody have a wonderful week.
And we hope to see you at the library checking out Walt's book.
Oh, please do. Thanks again. Bye-bye, everyone.
Also using Ancestry.com.
Yes.
We have it at the library.